IT Water Club this year, and it's my great honor tonight to introduce our keynote speaker for the evening. So one of the primary mandates of the Water Club this year and all years is to approach the subject of water issues from many different points of view, and in doing so, connect passionate people from many different diverse ranges of fields who all share a common interest in the water space, such as our panelists that we just heard from, and the ones we'll hear from tomorrow as well. Our speaker tonight is going to exemplify this approach, as this is exactly what he has done and accomplished in his career and continues to accomplish today. He has been involved for over 30 years at the nexus of engineering, environmental, and economic systems. The list of organizations with whom he has worked include the United Nations, the World Bank, and the USAID. He is lead author on the 2nd and 5th IPCC assessments, the World Water Vision, and the UN World Water Development Report. Currently a research scientist in the Joint Program on the Science and Policy of Global Change, he's also an alumnus of MIT. This is only a very small sample of what he's accomplished to date, but in the interest of time, I'd like to now invite our keynote speaker to the podium. Please welcome Professor Kenneth Strzepek.
Is the mic working? Okay, so we can start till it gets going. And so it's a privilege to be here, and I thought we had a fantastic panel. And the committee did a really good job of trying to balance things, because they really came and provided a really, what I call bottom-up approach to some of the issues that we're facing in terms of climate change. And I'm going to try to turn it around, and I'm going to bring up a couple issues. And one of the topics that I want to bring up is scale. We're going to talk about scale and the importance of that drives this whole problem. The other thing you can see is the bottom two words on here, which is global change. What I want to focus on today in the issue of water as we look into the mid part of the century is the idea of global change, environmental change, not just climate change, that it's one part. And I want to try and put it in perspective today as we look at it. But then the theme of my talk is the solutions to these, that of what we're going to be dealing with today, and a lot of what we talked about already today, is a clash of values. We have solutions, but these solutions are going to bring us into clashing our values. And we'll look at that in just a minute as we go through this. So we are at the right place. As an alumnus, our mascot is a beaver. And the beavers don't build power plants, John, or desalinate. We build dams, right? So I don't know if we're going to divest of the beaver soon, but we're very hopeful that what the beaver can bring. And so so this is the right place to talk about it. And what I want to go through is we're going to look at the global water problem, the scale at that level. Look at the current situation, and then talk about what's driving change as we're looking at water. Driving change in demand, driving change in supply. And then how are we meeting these needs? Are we? Yes, but at what cost? And then how do we proceed? That's sort of the framework I want to look at today. And I'm hoping we'll still have some time at the end for some questions. Now, you saw this slide earlier. Thank you very much. And it was filled in with some updates. But basically, we have a closed water balance, and we have more precip over the land than there is over the water, and there's more evaporation over the oceans. So we have this cycle, and we take this water. And on the global scale, we're not doing bad. We have about 38 to 40 cubic kilometers of water every year, renewable, and we're using about 12.5 of that is available for human use. We use about 5.5 of that, or about 45% of that. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is, as we said before, to coin another Cambridge resident, Tip O'Neill, all politics are local. All climate change and all water use is local. And the Colonel will talk about that as well at any time you ask him. It's the local issues that add up. And so as we look at this on the globe, we see that the distribution of the water is about 70% of the global withdrawals are for irrigation, 20% for industry, and 10% for domestic use. And of that 20%, which is mostly in the OECD countries, in the US and Europe, about 50% of that water right there is just for thermal cooling, as he pointed out when we looked at that nuclear power plant. In the United States, there's more water used withdrawn for thermal cooling than for irrigation. And in Europe, it's 80-20. And so we start breaking down this scale. So we've gone the global scale, no problem. We start now looking at the continental scale. And there's two things that are important there. There's a great variety of water by continent. And there's also a great variability from year to year. And that's where the beaver came along and the engineers came along, is we don't like variability. We don't like variability for a number of reasons. Is we don't know what's coming next. How can we plan for the future if it is variable? And we have a lot of good applied mathematicians from here and around the world that try to do this to forecast. Doesn't it look a little bit like your 401k value, right? So some of the best time series analysts are in hydrologists and on the stock market. So we have lots of water, but we also have lots of people. And as we look at this, as we're going forward, what we end up with is some hot spots. And this is a really interesting thing that we're going to look at. You can see the red, and we heard about the southwest US. We see northern China, the Murray-Darling Basin in Australia, the Middle East. But then you see this new area over much parts of Africa, which we call economic water security. In Uganda, where we're working, only 13% of the people have access to water, and the amount of water there is 10 times the amount per capita that there is in the US. So it's not the amount of water, it's just not getting there clean to them on a reliable basis. So we have to deal with those issues as we move forward. So when we look at what are the drivers of the demand for water, well, these are some of the things that are going at us, but it's particularly the idea of growth, and it's the idea of urbanization and the scale. A lot of the solutions that were mentioned, and some are really exciting, and a lot of the things that Indigenous bring is at the small scale, the village level scale. But as we urbanize, we're already at 50% of the globe is urban right now. As we urbanize, we focus people, and then they want engineers to bring water. So do you know where all your water came from today? If you go outside of there, not in these bottles. This one's very clever because this came from Italy. The only thing that would have been worse if it came from Fiji, but oh, here it is. This is flown in from Fiji. So we can talk about the carbon footprint of that later. But it comes from Quabbin Reservoir. Where does New York City get its water? Where does Los Angeles get its water? Why? Because there's a concentration of people greater than the local amount, and the reach has to go out very large to bring that water. So this idea of scale comes in. So then the other thing that happens as we have water is this is just hot off the presses, the new UN Sustainable Development Goals. And we have 17 of them, which then have 126, and they're still fighting over it, indicators. But we don't have the time. If you go through all of these, many of these are leading to increased water demand. So if we look here, affordable and clean energy. Number 6, clean water and sanitation. The goals are to bring water to everyone. We then now want industry, innovation, and infrastructure. That's about water. We want energy. That relates to water. And so when we look at these goals, and then we want environmental protection, we want climate action, what we're going to find out is these goals have values behind them, and they're clashing. If we try to supply all of these, there are going to be conflicts and trade-offs between meeting these things, as well as where are the fundings going to be that come for that. So it is goals that we have to start working on and at the large scale. But one of the big things, we heard about it before, the energy-water nexus, the energy-water-food, land nexus, but it's a real issue as we look at development. So I spend half my time in Cambridge doing research and teaching, and the other half I'm focusing now in Africa on building climate-resilient infrastructure for development. And there we're working with stakeholders, and the issue there is they want to grow and they want to develop. And one of the keys to development is energy. So as we look at Paris, which is coming up around the corner, we are trying to stop and peak our emissions. This is some work from Jake Jacoby here at MIT. And as you see, if we just level it off at that area, we have to have more reductions than they're even going to take. So with the current Paris target, we see that by 2050, look at the emissions. China's emissions are going down. The rest of the developing countries are kind of constant. Where we're seeing this growth is in the others, and then Africa is a really important part of that. So Africa has to be worrying about its emissions as it grows. And then here what we're seeing is there's going to have to be a second cycle after Paris. It's been in the news lately. That Paris is not going to be enough to get to the 2 degrees. So we're going to have to bring it down more. So as we look to energy policy, how does that affect us? Well, let's look at South Africa, one of the largest energy users in Africa. And this is their plan for the next 40 years if there's no carbon tax. It's going to be coal. They have lots of coal. It's cheap. They don't have to truck it. It's domestic. It's there. That's what it's going to look like, and there's going to be a lot of emissions. And unless we get carbon capture and storage, this is going to be an issue. However, if they allow nuclear, they're going to get rid of coal by bringing in nuclear. Talk about the debate currently going on in South Africa where there are plans for 6 nuclear power plants to come online in the next 20 years. So there's a huge debate about it. That's values. Nuclear versus CO2. They need that energy for growth, for development. Now, there is another source, and that's this pink area up here. That's hydropower. We talked about how water will lead to mitigation. This is water for mitigation. Now, this is transported 2,000 kilometers from the Congo River, the Grand Inga project, which will be up to 40,000 megawatts, and that will be importing that. So the problem, the debate here is the colonel's in the room, do you want half of your energy supply coming from outside your country through Angola, Botswana, and other countries to your nation? So this is the value of national security. And this whole issue of what are you going to do for your energy depends, and that has great impacts on water because they also want to get water from the Zambezi River Basin as well. So this is the Zambezi River Authority, and they've just developed with the World Bank, and this report we were a part of here in MIT got involved. And this is what we call a Pareto frontier, where they're looking at different alternatives for developing the Zambezi River. And if we look up at the top, I don't know if we have a pointer, but up at the top left, where you're getting almost 45,000 gigawatt hours per year, that development has very little irrigation development in it, very little food production. If we go out to the other side, we focus on food production. We go from 2,000 acres irrigated to 800,000 irrigated. And so those were the ranges of it. So the settlement was, let's go and try to get what we call the knee of the Pareto curve or the trade-off curve. Let's get there and come out with something about 700,000 and about 32,000 gigawatts a year. So if we're trying to get as much clean energy, we're trading off clean energy versus food security and food production. So then here this becomes values again. And one of the other issues that was really important is where do jobs go with this? Where do the jobs go? Do you get more jobs by providing water for irrigation or water for hydropower? Then the other issue of equity comes. Who's going to get the benefit of that hydropower? Is it going to be industry and keep that money within the rich, or is it going to go to irrigation, which is going to be more for the poor? So these issues of poverty reduction, equity, they become really important in how we allocate the water. And again, an issue of values. So this is a quote that was found, but it was reiterated at a recent workshop we had in South Africa, and I'm just going to read it because it's the best way. There is no road to development that does not greatly improve access to energy services. If you look at the data, the number one indicator of increase in wealth, in economic wealth in a country is electricity per capita. That expanded access to energy is, for pro-poor, will be coal. Throughout Africa, there are fossil fuels. It's very easy to get, like we showed in South Africa. It is much cheaper to build a coal-fired power plant for 1,000 megawatts. It's about $1,000 a megawatt for coal, and it's $3,000 to $5,000 for hydropower. It's much more expensive. If you use any kind of discounting rate, the savings on the energy does not make up for the extra capital costs. And capital is one of the limiting things for developments that we see. So we have this dilemma. And this has caused great resentment in developing countries. There's simply not enough room for today's poor to develop along the same paths as the wealth have already developed. We've used up the carbon space, so they're being told you cannot grow with cheap energy like the rest of us did, and you have to do it at much more expensive energy, like in South Africa, nuclear or hydro is much more than their coal. So who's going to pay for that? Should they pay for that because we used up the carbon space in the atmosphere? That's another values issue that we have to deal with, and I have to deal with and listen at the breaks all the time. So we look at climate change. How's that going to do it? Well, this is the hydropower in southern Africa, and to 2050, this is the scale of uncertainty that we're facing, looking at the latest CMIP3 and CMIP5 models, doing a whole bunch of work that we've done. There's a huge uncertainty. The worst case situation is we'll lose about 15% of the value of energy by 2050, and in a few cases, some of the models show that we're going to have an increase. So this is the other problem facing us as we plan under climate change. We don't know what the future is. It's very uncertain. And the statement that it's going to get dry where it's drier and wet where it's wetter is generally the case, but there's not agreement among the 22 major models that are being used. And this is an example of that with not only 22 models, but other downscalings of them. And this is just some work to show you the uncertainty. So right here, Africa, as statistically in southern Africa, is going to be a loser under the future climate. So not only are they going uphill with their energy, there's rocks on the back because they also have climate change hitting them, increasing their irrigation demand. The next one's quite interesting of values is policy. Let's take a look at U.S. foreign policy on development of clean energy in Africa. The Secretary of the Treasury shall instruct the United States Executive Director, each international financial institution, World Bank, African Development Bank, where policies, to oppose any loan, grant, or policy such to institute the support of construction of any large hydropower plant. That's government law. But we don't want them to be putting out carbon. This is the International Rivers has led this and other groups that, for many good reasons, do not want hydropower because they're mega projects and cause environmental damages. So without dealing with, let's look at mitigation, let's look at alternatives, how can we deal with that? So we have this is what's going on. The World Bank, U.S. sits on the World Bank board by the U.S. is being instructed to veto any project for large major dams. On the other side, this is China, involved in major, 1/3 of all African infrastructure is funded by China right now. 1/3, and almost all of the hydropower. And the problem that happens is the World Bank and other institutions have safeguards, social safeguards and environmental safeguards. Those same safeguards do not come with the Chinese funds. So we have values there as well. So then we look at this and we say we're having change due to energy policy, but we're also having change due to this issue of growth. So some work that was done a few buildings over at the joint program by my colleagues is we looked at what's happening in the globe. You heard about a couple times about how much of the world is under water stress, and these are different levels of water stress. And we're showing that in the baseline here about now that we have about 3.3 billion people of the 6 or 7 that are living under water stress. And then we ran a series of different climate change runs, and that's with different models. We took the wettest model that's seen in the driest model for the land surfaces, and you see it doesn't change very much. It's a little bit of blip. But if we move to 2050 and look at the social and economic growth of population growth, as well as, so as we move from here to here, we look at population growth and we look at economic growth and the demand for water, then we're going to move to almost 5 billion people that are going to be under water stress. Now the population at that time is going to be about 8 or so. So percentage-wise, we're increasing, and we're increasing in number that are facing water stress. And again, these are the series of different ranges of the climate uncertainty we know. And again, it's kind of noise on the bigger move. So as we move here, this is an issue of the economic development that is going on. If we focus again and look at just Southeast Asia, one of the more rapidly growing places in the world, we look at this and we take it and look at this in a probabilistic way, what we find out is this is, in that region, what is the current level of water stress. These are the number of people that are slightly water stressed, moderately heavy, overly, and extreme. And then we look at, if you just look at growth here, we see that just climate are these little green boxes. So again, it's noisy compared to just the growth, which are the blue boxes. So the great uncertainty and the great changes we're seeing are due to population and economic growth, and a lot of that driven by energy use as well, and all of the different uses that water brings. And we'll talk about that in a minute, where that specifically comes from. And then if you take a look at that and look at it probabilistically, these are the box and whiskers. What you're seeing is this is for all of Southeast Asia. For China, we see that the biggest moves are for the socioeconomic. Climate change is a smaller amount. If you put them together, you have an exacerbated problem. So climate change is not a small problem. It's just another problem of the many that we're having in terms of water management as we move through the future. Now, the good news is we have things like JWASH. We have things like all of our other colleagues here and at this and other institutions that are doing research to try to change the water intensity of our industries. But at the same time, what we're seeing is this is China, and it gets called sometimes China's urban 1 billion. So the big thing that's happening is this urbanization. So while we have to deal, that's why I said about scale, what we're doing is we're bringing people and concentrating together, which leads to problems. The number of megacities that are growing are amazing. But if we just take a look at China, right now there are about 500 million people that are urban, and by 2025, it's already close to 1 billion, and as we move through, it's going to be quite a bit, and they're moving to different sizes of cities. So we want to get creative, and here we have a Center for New Urbanism. How can we make this different as we move forward? But as we look at water supply, what's the issue? Well, currently, in the urban centers, they have about 95%, almost full control of urban water. In the rural areas, only about 45% have water. If we look at how much water is being used currently, this is an average over the country, there's about 40 liters per person per day in the rural, but about 200 in the city. Because when you move to the city, you move to apartments, the new buildings, it's all the modern building, you have a toilet, you have sinks, you have other things that lead it to you. And so if the population doesn't grow, and you just move 500 million more people to the urban area, you have 5 times more water demand. So just that issue alone is going to increase that. That's part of what we're seeing in that jump. What is climate change? The supply loss is nowhere near this. It's just a huge issue of this concentration. And we need the concentration. If you talk to industrial economists, you don't have industrial growth in the rural areas. It doesn't work. You have to have the concentration around cities. And the big issue at the recent conference on development in Helsinki was what's happening is this structural change. You're not going to get a poverty reduction by just doubling your yields of all your crops. We have to figure out ways to bring wealth in, and that's called structural change, going more towards industry and moving that industry, which leads then to urbanization. So can we break that cycle? That's a question as we move there. That's a value issue, again, of what is development. The other one that was brought up, and we're talking about here, is food versus nature. And so this was a study we did looking at, if you take the 2,000 agricultural withdrawals in the globe, which is about that 70%, about 3 billion cubic meters of water, and if you were to give a conservative estimate of what this is called environmental flow requirements, if you allow right now, this is about allowing 15% of the water to flow to the sea. Does anybody know how much of the flow of the Colorado River goes to the sea? Close to zero, 25,000, and we're buying more every day. People are buying it, put it to zero. So if we look here at North America, and if we were to allow that 10%, that means 15%